I'd like to invite Mike to give his presentation. So Mike Williams from the UK Treasury.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. I'll try not to duplicate any of what Pascal said, but in a sense, there's the OECD's view of history, which inevitably, to a large extent, coincides with the UK's view of history. So I fear that there may be some element of repetition. If we go back to the three transfer pricing actions from the BEPS report, actions 8 to 10, I think it's fair to say that there was some progress. Equally, the amount of progress was rather a disappointment to the UK, and I recall that we said so at the time. It was, I think, the G20 finance ministers were meeting in Lima in Peru, and it was October 2015, and George Osborne said we were rather disappointed. And Pascal will remember this, because I think Pascal was told to tell us that the OECD was disappointed that we were disappointed. But we coped with that as best we could, and we all moved on. I think the fact that, for the reasons I think that Pascal identified, that we didn't make that much progress on transfer pricing in the BEPS report, it's perhaps therefore not that surprising that we're where we are. We're where we are in terms of countries being dissatisfied with the rules, and we're where we are in terms of countries adopting unilateral measures because they're not prepared to wait for a long-term solution. I think for the UK, the key issue is the stress on the international tax rules from some high-tech business models in particular. Why? Because they knew they reflect things that really didn't happen, if you like, in the old economy. You get free services. There have always been loss leaders. There have always been circumstances in which you got something for free for a while to see whether you like the product or not, whether you like the service or not. But of course, as the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, says, if you offer a free service forever in the traditional economy, then you go bankrupt because you're not getting any sort of remuneration in return for it. People don't do that. You don't get free offers that last forever. But we now find that there are free services that last forever. But of course, that's because in using those services, you are providing data which is then harvested and marketed and monetized. So it is possible, therefore, to provide a free service in perpetuity. That wasn't something that we saw before because of the bankruptcy issue. Similarly, you have social media websites where users generate substantially all of the content. There isn't anything much else there at all other than material that has been put there by the users who interact with each other through the website. Again, that's quite new. On the other hand, I think it's all very well saying the whole of the economy is now digitalised, but I worry that that's no more than a slogan. And if you actually look, there are these new things like free services that last forever. There are these social media websites where the users generate the content. But contrast that with something like aircraft sales, or the sale of the engines on aircraft. Is that different from how it was 50 years ago? Not probably that different. Or if you look at something like the sale of milk, 50 years ago, in the UK at least, the milk was largely delivered to people's houses on a milk float and was largely delivered in glass bottles. Then we moved to a world in which it was largely delivered in Tetra Paks and you got it in the supermarket yourself. And now we're in a world where it's still in some sort of packaging, and you either get it delivered with the rest of your groceries or you get it at a convenience store or at a supermarket. But you're buying essentially the same product in largely the same circumstances as before. Digitalising milk, I think, would be a struggle too far for both us and also the suppliers. Some things have changed, some things haven't changed, and I think we need to reflect that as well. Because the reality is that businesses would struggle if we just threw everything up in the air and started again. Most countries would struggle with that. People wouldn't know what they were getting, so they'd never agree. So, I mean, where are we from the UK perspective, reflecting that some things have changed a lot, some things haven't changed much, and of course things will continue to change. I mean, we are still keen on there being some principle underlying all this. We are still keen on resting on value creation as a supply side or producer proposition. But what does value creation mean where you've got a social media platform where the users generate everything that's there? So we are keen on value creation, but we need to reflect and update what we mean by that to take into account changes in the world. Equally, I think we have to reflect that not everything has changed. If I sort of hold up my principal prop, my iPhone, how much has really changed in relation to that? It's a high value physical good. And if we look at the little letters on the back, in terms of value creation, it tells us, because of course it's part of the branding, that it was designed by Apple in California and assembled in China. Now, if you believe in producer-side value creation, how much of that activity then should you be seeking to tax in the UK? Because I bought this in the UK. It's difficult to see that much has changed there. We bought cars in the UK that have been manufactured abroad for many decades. Why is this iPhone different? On the other hand, there's the point that Pascal flagged. We have also taxed. There's also value consumption in this physical good. When I bought it, obviously I paid 20% VAT, which went into the Exchequer's coffers. So there's value creation, there's value consumption. Equally, of course, inside the bag of tricks, there are apps and things like that where there is scope, for example, for user engagement there. But on the one hand, that the phone is a reflection of the modern economy, and I guess some would argue that, in a sense, it's caused parts of the modern economy. But on the other hand, it's just this very valuable physical product. We've always had very, very valuable physical products, and the rules have largely coped with divvying up the profits from the sale of those products to be taxed in different countries. So, some things have changed, some things have stayed the same. And we need, I think, to reflect both. I mean, in terms of the two pillars, I think we are most concerned about, most interested in pillar one. And kind of we would be back to what George Osborne said in Peru in October 2015. We were disappointed we didn't make more progress on modernising the transfer pricing rules. It's not therefore surprising that in July 2019 we're keen to look at nexus and at profit allocation in pillar one. I think as part of that, we've got to solve the digital problem. That doesn't mean that we necessarily stop the digital. We may want to look somewhat beyond digital, but a solution that doesn't fully address the digital problem. It seems to me, addressing this in the University of Oxford, in terms of, it doesn't solve the exam question. The key exam question is, how do you solve the problem with high-tech digital businesses stressing the current rules? If you don't solve that, you haven't solved the problem. In a sense, you then repeat the difficulties that we got from the BEPS project. But that's where we started, so we ought to do better a second time round. Equally, obviously, there is pressure from unilateral measures. There is pressure on countries that have adopted unilateral measures to scrap those measures when a long-term solution is in place. And that's fine. And we have said that once there is a long-term solution, we would abolish our digital services tax. But there has to be a solution. It can't be something that solves some entirely different problem and sort of says, well, you told us that these high-tech digital companies were what you were bothered about. We've got a task force on digital, not a task force on the sale of milk or on the sale of aircraft. We do have to solve the digital problem, or else we in effect have sort of ducked the challenge. If I go on talking a bit more detail on pillar one, it is about profit allocation. It is about nexus I think I've heard Pascal say before that nexus is a thing that interests politicians, but profit allocation is probably the thing that's more important, sort of technically and in terms of making the thing work. I think that's right. Equally, we do have to fix nexus in a satisfactory way. And I think the absolute key is you've got to do the two together. Again, learning from the BEPS project. You can't do one and then sort out the other. I think there is a very key point that this is all more open than it was in the BEPS project. I think in truth in the BEPS project we looked quite early on at things like formula apportionment. We looked for rather longer at whether there were special measures that you could use to adapt the arm's length principle. We abandoned what you might call fundamental reform early on in the project. We decided against special measures, much I think to the UK's disappointment part of the way through. In a sense, we closed down on profit allocation pretty quickly in the BEPS project, but as Pascal said, we're not doing that this time. The January materials that were issued, I think, are clear that we need to not just look within the arm's length principle for solutions, and indeed that part of the solution, I think, almost inevitably has to be a bit outside the arm's length principle. Of course, the question then is how far outside. Also, how do you then link to what you have left? Because if you're going to have thresholds for businesses being affected by the new rules, what about when they grow into those rules? I think equally, it's right that we look at a group basis. It's right that we look at how you allocate the non-routine profits on a group basis, because a large part of the problem with transfer pricing has been that you sort of forget about the group, even though it's plainly in the group that matters in many ways. So we do need to look at the group, but equally we need to recognise that there are quite good reasons why we have the arm's length principle, and it does create structure for dealing with transfer pricing, if you're a business, for dealing with transfer pricing if you're a tax administration, or if you're one country dealing with another because the tax administrations are in dispute. I've heard people say, oh, we should just scrap Article 9 of the Model Tax Convention and just apply Article 7 to the group as a whole, and ignoring the problems where you don't get 100% own groups, assume you've only got 100% group. Fine, but if you look at the struggle we had to get the approved OECD approach under Article 7, if you look at the fact that not everybody agreed to that, but also, to me, it's a bit then like trying to tax Mr. Blobby. You've got this group that may have vast numbers of different activities. The idea that I think you can easily apply Article 7 across the whole of that without vast amounts of difficulty, without great disputes, I don't think you can. So how far do we move from the arm's length principle, and in what circumstances, I think is what we are looking at. And how far do you go whole economy? Do you go just high-tech digital businesses? Do you go a bit beyond high-tech digital businesses and look at cases where there is active engagement in an economy, which may be something that grows over time? But the minute you've said you're only going so far, you do need to maintain a link to the existing arm's length rules. Equally, if you're saying that some countries, for example, with user participation, are going to tax more profits than they do now, again, you've only half answered the exam question if you stop there. You've got to say where those profits are coming from. If you don't say where those profits are coming from, then you've almost inevitably created double taxation. So that needs to be sorted out. And again, if you look on a group basis, how do you do that where you have a model tax convention, which is bilateral? How do you do that where that existing structure implies you look at transactions between two entities in a group? So all that needs to be looked through. I think also, and there's quite a lot of debate about this that we might want to come on to, there's a debate, I think, between countries that say, oh, you've got to have a principle here. because everything else then hangs off the principle, and other countries that say, oh, but we will never agree on what the principle is, we must just come to the answer. And it seems to me that in reality, we will need an element of principle in this, not least to provide an anchor. Because I think if you don't do that, then countries will not be sure what they're buying into, and therefore they will be less likely to agree. Equally, if you have no element of principle, why would it endure? Why wouldn't some countries just come back for more in 3 or 4 years? What is to constrain that? If there's nothing to constrain that, why would you bother to do all this? If you were going to have that degree of uncertainty, I don't think you would. Whether it's in truth sort of one overriding principle, I very much doubt that is where we will get to. Equally, I think many of the people who say, oh, we shouldn't have started the project until we'd agreed the principle, I can think, well, yes, but then we would never started. We have to be realistic. There are over 100 countries involved. The idea that we are going to agree, a one-paragraph principle between us, we're not. So I think it's a lot more about the rationale for what we're doing. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to do? And the narrative around that. But I think that if you don't have any sort of rationale or any sort of narrative, I don't see how you lock it sufficiently in a world where inevitably some countries are bound to be tempted to come back and ask for more. At that point, you've got to be able to say, but this more that you're asking for isn't consistent with the rationale or the narrative. If you've got no rationale or narrative, just an agreement, don't they just come back and say, well, we agreed that 3 years ago, but things have changed, and therefore you start it all again. So I think we mustn't be over-ambitious in what we can do here, but I think without any sort of ambition, you don't get enough to lock the project. If I go on briefly to Pillar 2, we are interested in exploring this. I think that there are many difficult issues to be looked at. Pascal's mentioned blending. I think blending is a hugely important and difficult thing. Do you do it on a global basis, so all the foreign subsidiaries? Do you do it by country? Do you do it by entity within a group? Obviously, for any particular level of minimum effective tax rate, how much that bites then is dependent on whether you allow blending or not. So there's a sense in which there's a prior question before you can get to a rate, and you can't, for example, compare the rate in the guilty with what we're doing here unless and until you're clear that you're applying the same sort of blending, and we may not be. That's open for debate. I think there's an argument you can do this outside treaties, but I think if you start looking at the detail of this, actually, do you need some sort of treaty protection? To me, at conceptual level, this is saying that if a country leaves money on the table, there may in future be circumstances where some other country can grab some of that money. But unless you've got some codification about who gets to grab the extra money first, what do you do when everybody does? Which to me implies some sort of treaty to address that. And I think two other very detailed points on this. The measurement point I wouldn't at all underestimate. It's very technical, but I think it's quite crucial. 3 examples of why. If you look at losses, the UK in larger cases generally allows 50% of carried forward losses against profits in a year. So in a year, we'll see profits there and expect some tax on those profits. If we apply those UK rules to a foreign subsidiary or a foreign company in a country that allows full usage of losses in a year, it will have no profit, so it won't pay tax. But does that mean that you are below the minimum? Similarly, there are countries like the United States that provides accelerated depreciation for capital expenditure. There are other countries like the UK that don't, both of which perfectly legitimate policy choices. There isn't some sort of avoidance or malfeasance or trickery in this. It's just done different ways. It's only timing, but again, if you're doing that, you've got to look at a snapshot, just as you do with a tax return, how to deal with that. And there's also an issue with something like stock options, where there are different ways of working out what deduction you should give for stock options. Again, the US approach is different from the UK approach, and they give different numbers. It's not there just a timing thing, it's just different ways of looking at how you deal with stock options. But again, both are legitimate. How do you accommodate that in a system without it sort of throwing up false cases where, allegedly you should be topping up, but actually there's no logical reason why you should. So I think that's a hugely important aspect of it. And finally, then I'll stop. I think the other crucial point is the EU law aspect. Many of the participants in this process are member states of the EU. We, presumably by the time this is agreed, will no longer be bound by EU law because we will have Brexited, but there are 27 other member states who will continue to be bound by EU law. And it seems to us we are better off thinking about what the EU law implications are, what the EU law constraints might be now, rather than coming up with a solution and then somebody looking at that solution in 18 months and saying, oh, if only you considered EU law, you wouldn't have taken this step part of the way through. We need to build in considerations of EU law now so that we don't waste time and we don't find that we're having to do work twice. I think if you look at the EU law constraints, particularly around the freedoms, I think you can fairly readily identify in broad terms what some of those constraints are. They may impact on things like blending as well, which is yet a further reason why you need to know now rather than later. Otherwise, I think you will go backwards and forwards on this. But anyway, let me stop there. Thank you.